The speaker just ran to the restroom, so apologies. We'll start in about 2 minutes, I imagine. Yeah, and people are still slowly coming in, and we're going to stream on Facebook and to YouTube, and then it will be archived after. Through the Paris. Oh, good. And it'll be archived after, and so it tends to get traction too. We can share links. Oh, it will close captioning. No, they're doing it live, I believe. Yeah. According to Lydia, I just checked in, and it should be captioned as it goes. Yeah. Okay, our speakers. Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Greetings, everybody. Welcome. Good evening. Welcome, everyone. I'm Navina Haider of the Department of Islamic Art here at the Met. And it's my pleasure to welcome everybody to our annual Turkish Centennial Initiative lecture. This is an initiative that was founded in 2019 by our department in partnership with members of the community, the Turkish community. And the aim is to celebrate Turkish and Ottoman art and culture and its global reach. Soon after we founded and got started, we were hit, of course, by COVID, like everybody else, and much of our early sort of planning was interrupted and had to go online and so on. But we are now beginning to do more in-person events. We're beginning to regroup more actively, and we plan to put all of our passion and our excitement about this initiative back in and rev up to next year, when we'll actually be celebrating the 100th year anniversary of the Turkish Republic, and we will have a number of major programs around that. So we warmly invite you to everything that we're doing and to celebrate this extraordinary heritage that we have, and we're so proud to have at the Met in our department, but in other departments too. I'd like to say a special thanks to the committee, the Turkish Centennial Committee, that has helped and guided us with so many of the programs and so many of the aspects of the initiative that have been developed. And thanks to them and thanks to the efforts of others, we've been able to do some interesting things. And today is a great highlight because we have an annual lecture. And today we're very happy to welcome Professor Nebahat Avcıoğlu of Hunter College, who is a wonderful colleague, a wonderful speaker. If you haven't heard her before, you're in for a treat today. And she will be introduced by my colleague, Deniz Beyazıt. So, with that, I just welcome all of you again, and I hand over to Deniz for the further introduction. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Navina. Well, welcome, everyone. I think this is the first public lecture in Sacerdote since more than 2 years, so that is pretty good news, I can say. And I would say it feels really very good to see so many old and new friends. And I hope we can do more in this room and in other spaces at the Met. I really thank you to have made it today on this rainy late afternoon Friday. And I also wanted to thank the supporters. Several of the committee members of the Turkish Centennial Initiative are here today. Without you, this wouldn't be possible, and I look forward to continue working with you and to do more. I also wanted to say special thanks to all those who you're not seeing. They work behind the scenes to take care of the logistics. Our colleagues in the education department, particularly Mariana Siciliano, Hannah McHale, Alice Schwartz, Francesca D'Alessio, Karina, I don't have your last name, sorry, but all those who help us doing all these programmings. And of course, as always, a big thank you to our administrative genius, Helen Goldenberg, and to my department head, Navina Haidar, for all her support and co-thinking in this project. Now it is with great pleasure and honor to introduce today's speaker, my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Nebahat Avcıoğlu. Dr. Avcıoğlu is an associate professor at Hunter College. She specializes in Islamic architecture and art, with a particular emphasis on Ottoman European culture encounters. She's an established scholar and has lectured and published extensively with very diverse interests. If I say diverse, I mean it that way. Her publications focus on imperialism, art and travel, the Enlightenment and exoticism, the fascinating costume albums, or 19th century Orientalism in architecture. She is also an expert on post-classical history of Istanbul and modern and contemporary mosques in Europe. As you can imagine from these interests, her publication list is very long. I'm going to just mention a few of her books. They include Turquerie and the Politics of Representation, which was published by Ashgate in 2011, and in 2014, the Turkish edition came out by Koç University Press in Istanbul. She is also the editor of The Culture of Albums in the 18th Century, the co-editor of Art and Identity in Venice and its Territories, or of Globalizing Cultures, Art and Mobility in the 18th Century. For today's lecture, she will revisit and expand for us her broad knowledge on Turquerie, a subject she has been working on for several decades now. It's not going to leave her, and I'm really very happy to have her here today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Avcıoğlu.
Thank you very much, Deniz, for this very generous introduction. I hope I'll be living up to it. I would also like to extend my thanks to Navina Haidar and her team for their kind invitation, and to the Turkish Centennial Fund for making this event possible. It's a indeed pleasure and an honor to be here today and to have the opportunity to speak about the topic of Turquerie, which is a revisit, because that was something I had published several years ago and kind of moved on from that. But it's a topic close to my heart. Okay, thank you. Okay. So this is the title of my talk, Turquerie, Ottoman European Cultural Exchanges in the 18th Century. What is Turquerie? The history of a word is often a very useful entry point for delving into the cultural practices and modes of representation that this word may refer to, particularly if the word happens to designate a style, that is to say, a visual discourse. The need for a definition is always a sign of a powerful and complex phenomenon. My topic today is no exception to that rule. Turquerie, a French word, does not appear in the Oxford English Dictionary, unlike chinoiserie, another French word. Turquerie first entered in the French dictionary, Le Littré, in the middle of the 19th century, where it was explained after Molière as a Turkish-like behavior. It then made its way into the Dictionnaire de l'Académie Française as an artistic or literary composition produced in Western Europe, whose theme or picturesque details are borrowed from Turkish culture and Oriental forms. This heterogeneous body of forms, images, material culture, and attitudes has attracted compelling scholarship in the last 25 years, especially in the last 25 years, grounded in a wider history of the shifting relationship between Europe and the Ottoman Empire. Yet, for all these rich possible interpretive tracks through forms, objects, tastes, or mindset, one is often left wondering, which one exactly should one pursue in order to pin down a clear definition of Turquerie? When one terminology alone seeks and succeeds to mingle all of the above, something quite consequential surely is taking place. Yet one must always keep in mind these purposefully vague and contradictory original definitions, stretching from resemblances and attitudes, likeness and behavior, to motifs and shapes, all conspiring to an oriental essence, so as to discern the strategic, epistemic, i.e. imperialist, entanglement that this French word, Turquerie, was coined to suggest. In turn, it could help us identify the feedback political efficiency of sorts inside France and across Europe that this discourse was capable of providing. In short, Turquerie is all at once a window and a mirror, a window through which Europeans looked into the Ottoman world from a distance to keep danger, cultural and military, at bay, whilst extracting capital, symbolic and otherwise, from it. A mirror on which they projected their own otherness and used it in an internal competition for legitimacy. In terms of chronology, early definitions of Turquerie do not provide an exhaustive time frame. The earliest studies by French diplomat Auguste Bopp focus primarily on the 18th century, the era of reciprocal diplomatic relations between France and the Ottoman Empire. Bopp was writing at the very beginning of the 20th century when based in Istanbul while the Ottoman Empire was still ongoing, albeit just. This is important to note because the subsequent scholarship, burdened by hindsight, often associates the proliferation of Turquerie or stereotypical images of the Turk with the weakening and eventual demise of the Ottoman Empire in 1923. In Le Peintre de Bosphore, a book Bopp published in 1911, the same year as the very first exhibition of Turquerie held at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris, and to which Bopp loaned many items from his own private collection, he gives a special place to Jean-Baptiste Van Moor, Jean-Baptiste Van Moor and Antoine de Favre, two early 18th century artists remembered for their extensive sojourn in Istanbul in the 18th century. Bopp's corpus also includes representations by artists who never traveled to the Ottoman Empire, naming them the painters of the Turk, Pantro Turk, such as Karl van Loo and Jean-Honoré Fragonard, as well as by those who stayed home but had the opportunity to observe Ottoman ambassadors in Paris and Versailles during great feasts and parades held in their honor, such as Charles Paracel for the first permanent Ottoman ambassador, 28 Çelebi Mehmet Efendi's entry, and Jacques Avet, who paints the second ambassador, Mehmet Said Efendi, who's in fact the son of the first ambassador. So these are painted in Paris by French artists. Bopp, the last group of artists who are described by Bopp as forgotten and included in his study are the artists such as Jean-Baptiste Hilaire and Jean-François Cassas, who were working for Comte de Choisy-Gouffier, the French ambassador to Constantinople in 1784, and others like Antoine Ignace Melling, who was part of the Russian delegation and subsequently worked for the British and Dutch ambassadors before becoming the architect and art advisor to Hatice Sultan, favorite sister of the reigning Sultan Selim III. What is crucial here is that Bob's emphasis on the 18th century organically linked Turquerie to the Enlightenment, thus foregrounding the topography of subsequent writings exploring European expansion, travel, diplomacy, and liberty in ideas of self-fashioning as well as of technological discoveries, which in turn went hand in hand with an interest in and a discursive instrumentalization of the other, a point I will return later in my talk. This strict genealogy of Bob is both challenged and advocated by scholars who variously marked the beginning of Turquerie with the fall of Constantinople in 1453, to draw attention to the longue durée or extensive historicity of Ottoman-European relations. For example, Ernst Grubb and Eleanor Sims, in their 2006 article, argue that early depictions of Turks as vicious warriors were later replaced by Western European visual culture embracing the stylish fineries and decorative arts of the Ottomans, citing as evidence the martyrdom of Armerio Albano from the Palazzo Ducale in Venice, painted in 1550, and the portrait of an unknown European woman in Turkish dress by Jean-Étienne Lyotard in 1752. Other scholars focusing on the intensification of trade of objects and ideas date the origins of Turquerie to around the period of the failed siege of Vienna in 1683 and the subsequent peace treaty of Karlowitz signed in 1699 between the Holy Roman League and the Ottoman Sultan. Following this event, the Turk emerged in a playful state in fine and decorative arts, on stage and operatic scenarios, as a catharsis and as a way to find out more about the Turk. Material cross-culture is both cognitive and symbolic. In it, the other is simultaneously studied and reduced to literal things. The British author Paul Ryko's use of Ottoman manuscripts in his history of the Empire, Ottoman Empire, is one such example. The rhetoric of authenticity being a perfect example of the strategy of intertwining knowledge and representation with power. European treatises on coffee also heavily borrowed from Ottoman sources, just as the beginning of Parisian coffee consumption was triggered by a visit of the Turkish ambassador, Süleyman Ağa, in 1669 in Paris. He's the earliest ambassador, very brief visit. At his lodgings, elite visitors from court and city were served coffee by servants dressed in Turkish garb. This also led to mass-produced objects like small coffee cups recognizably Ottoman, but not the coffee houses, which also proliferated during the late 17th century in Paris and in London, but they retained their sort of local character rather than the Ottoman ways. While little consensus exists as to when the Turquerie began, where to place the chronological cursor has been important for questioning the role of France as the primus locus of this practice, or for stressing the importance of including architecture, furniture, and ephemera, such as pamphlets or warfare material, into its histories. This new and ongoing, the new and ongoing studies effectively pluralize the subject of Turqueries beyond national and disciplinary boundaries. Today, I'm not going to inundate you with countless examples of images, buildings, and artifacts, if I haven't already done so, that have absorbed elements from the Ottomans, as the significance of the genre cannot be measured only in quantitative terms. Their complexity of detail and subtlety of thought demand a careful look both at individual works and at the very persona of the individuals behind these works. Indeed, moving across scales of sovereignty throughout the 18th century, Turquerie became a cultural signifier through which to carry out emancipatory strategies by means of self-identification with a powerful other, seen as able to resist domestic or national conventions. Let me unpack this claim with just a few examples. Around 1725, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, wife of the English ambassador at Sublime Porte, Constantinople, had her portrait painted by Jonathan Richardson, ostensibly dressed in Turkish costume. In 1728, Stanislas Leszczynski, twice deposed King of Poland, posed, but at this stage he was deposed once, posed for Jean-Baptiste Le Mercier, dressed as Sultan Ahmed III. 10 years later, under French protection at Lunéville, near Nancy in France, he built a number of kiosks, Turkish palatial architectural unit, inspired by the Sultan's palace in Istanbul. In 1742, in London, a rather unusual pavilion called the Turkish tent appeared at Vauxhall. I don't know if this works, but does it work? Never mind. It's the third one from the right. In 1742, in London, a rather unusual pavilion called the Turkish tent appeared at Vauxhall Gardens, itself a novelty as a public garden at the time. 20 years later, in 1763, William Chambers, future professor of architecture at the Royal Academy, erected a Turkish mosque at Kew Gardens, the very first in Western Europe, albeit a garden ornament. Meanwhile, in Istanbul, the French ambassador to the Sublime Porte, Comte de Vergennes, posed seated, cross-legged on cushions for Antoine de Favre in 1766, a rare representation of a serving diplomat in Turkish costume. Looking at these endeavors, which could also include that of Madame de Pompadour's at Versailles, one can either turn a blind eye and see them as nothing more than the whims of a few eccentrics making up an insignificant fashion, or we can deem them worthy of a sustained intellectual engagement and learn about the transportation of artistic knowledge across cultural frontiers, its various modalities, the bold political strategies behind the transfer, and the rhetorical imagination required to make use of it. So, why have these people felt the need to cross national boundaries, norms, habits, and visual codes? What is the relationship between who they are and what they practice, so similar in appearance, yet so different in meanings? How did they carry out their various strategies, and were they successful? I argue that the emulation of Turkish cultural models and codes is best understood in the context of the power strategies through which these monarchs, aristocrats, and state officials sought to establish or reshape their identities. One feature they all shared was indeed the precariousness of their public persona and a sense of alienation. Stanislas had lost his kingdom. Frederick, who was behind the Vauxhall Gardens, Frederick, Prince of Wales, was disfavored, even disowned by his mother, Queen Caroline. Lady Mary and Pompadour, Madame de Pompadour, were ambitious and educated men in a man's world, and Count Vergennes was an ambassador at odds with the establishment. Their choice was not random, in that the Ottomans provided an equally sophisticated culture of power as well as a clear demarcation from symbolic systems too close to home. In the 18th century, in particular, the relationship between the Ottoman Empire and Europe formed a more or less balanced power structure, predicated upon the belief that they embodied alternative monarchical and social models for each other. The striking portrait of Stanislas dressed as an Ottoman sultan forms a pair with the portrait of his wife, Catherine Opelinska. Both paintings are today located in the Château de Chambord, where Stanislas was officially housed after the marriage of his daughter, Marie Leczinska, to King Louis XV in 1725. In a way, this kind of portrait is a common type of commission by people who traveled to the Ottoman Empire or had some links with it in the 17th and early 18th centuries. Portraits of Lady Mary and Richard Pocock readily spring to mind. Yet, Le Mercier's tableau is unusual. Unlike any known portraits of Western Europeans dressed à la Turque, Stanislas is presented as the Sultan, which is clearly a reference to his status as king, which has been then contested. He is depicted wearing a sumptuous red short-sleeved outer garment, a kaftan in Turkish, with white ermine lining, usually worn in the summer months by Ottoman sultans. He also wears a blackish front opening robe, typical of Ottoman ceremonial costumes, made from gold and silver thread, as indicated by the splashes of luminosity, a jewelry-encrusted belt, and a brooch. This ostentatious outfit is completed with a hybrid headgear, a crown turban, in gold and silk, decorated with pearls, precious stones, feathers, and topped with a small crescent. It is this unusual object that immediately attests to Stanislas's identity as a ruler and to the originality of the thinking that lies behind the commission. The tall and richly decorated turban, known as kalavi, that Stanislas is wearing, is not only associated with a sultan, but with Ahmed III in particular, during whose reign Stanislas took refuge in the Ottoman Empire after his defeat at Poltava in 1709. Images of Ahmed III with this type of turban circulated all over Europe in engraved, painted, or miniature formats, and thus could readily have been seen by Stanislas and his circle. Le Mercier never traveled to the Ottoman Empire. The fact Le Mercier's portrait finds clear resonance in Jean-Baptiste Van Moore's paintings, reproduced in Recueil de son Destin, published in Paris in 1714, copies of which were deposited at Versailles, is the fact. The two images from the Recueil are clearly mined by the painter for the depiction of Sultan's turban and the pose with the handkerchief. In Western Europe, the Sultan's handkerchief is usually associated with palace intrigues. Paul Rico, I already mentioned him before, secretary to the English ambassador in 1660, was one of the first Europeans to discuss the handkerchief within the context of the Sultan's harem. He wrote that, I quote, "When the Grand Seigneur resolves to choose himself a bedfellow, he throws his handkerchief to her. She comes running and kneels before him, and sometimes enters in at the feet of the bed, according to the ancient ceremony." I don't know what ancient ceremony he's talking about. Unquote. Given the presence of the Kızlar, that is to say, the black eunuch in charge of the imperial harem, Van Moore's portrait of the Sultan with the handkerchief clearly perpetuates this intrigue. However, this claim was vehemently discredited by Lady Mary a few years later, who was able to access the harem in the early 18th century. On one occasion, she wrote to her correspondent that your whole letter is full of mistakes from one end to the other. Sultana assured me that the story of the handkerchief, so firmly believed among us, has not a syllable of truth." Unquote. She said it. The origin of the story about the handkerchief is unknown, and the debates around it seem to exist only in Western Europe. Within the Ottoman context and in Eastern Europe, where Stanislas had his cultural origins, the combination of a kaftan and handkerchief was seen as a sign of authority. For instance, Hungarian Stefan Batory, who is considered to be one of the greatest elected kings of Poland and the founder of Sarmatianism, had his portrait painted by Martin Kober in a ceremonial kaftan, hilat, holding a handkerchief. Sarmatianism is described by the art historian Thomas da Costa Kaufmann, I quote, as an openness to Oriental influences, especially in costume and coiffure, unquote. Báthori, before becoming the ruler of Poland, was a vassal of the Ottomans and the son of a partisan of John Zapolya, who was crowned as the king of Hungary by Sultan Süleyman in 1529. With this gesture, the Sultan came to be known in Europe as the distributor of crowns. In this context, Stanislas's painting should be considered as harking back to Báthori's portrait rather than perpetuating a European fantasy about the Sultan's bedroom habits. With this portrait, Stanislas both looks back nostalgically to the heydays of the Sarmatians and forward to his future inauguration as the King of Poland, possibly under protection, as suggested by the emblematic significance of the crown-turban union. Thus, while the turban identifies Stanislas with an Eastern ruler, the union with a Western crown suggests more than simply masquerading as an Ottoman sultan. Stanislas represents himself as a distinctive royal personage rather than as a king without a kingdom, an abject supplicant at the French court. Stanislas's portrait was commissioned while he was continuing his ambitions to regain the Polish throne, which he single-mindedly pursued until 1736, when he lost it again for good. Twice deposed and dispossessed of his throne and several times displaced, Stanislas found in architecture the expression of permanence. In 1737, while he was under French protection at Lunéville, he commissioned a kiosk, he called it a kiosk, with, with close stylistic resemblance to Turkish palatial architectural prototypes to be built in his estate. This was not his first venture into Ottoman architecture, and he built a second, very different one the following year, and later others in his other estates. Self-representation can properly be achieved within a system of legitimacy, where mimetic identification can find both marked separations and similarities within the symbolic system, feeding the other and self-polarities with dynamic yet practical cultural expressions. The portrait of Madame de Pompadour, the mistress of Louis XV from 1744 to 1751, and in particular the Turkish Sultana taking coffee by Carl van Loo, another artist who never went to the Ottoman Empire, decorating the interior of the Turkish room at the Château de Bellevue, has been discussed in terms of such dispersal of the subject and construction of power, inspired by an illustration in an Ottoman costume album brought to France as a gift by the Ottoman Ambassador, 28 Çelebi Mehmet Efendi. the Turkish Sultana in Van painting has been identified by Perenstein, a curator at the Met, in fact, as a portrait of Pompadour herself, and has been interpreted as a kind of veiled genre painting representing self-commentary, designating the design to elevate Pompadour's position from mere mistress to a royal favorite, if not to a queen. Thus, the painting's phantasmagoria, Pompadour simultaneously as herself and as a sultana in disguise, acts as a mirror that constantly unsettles not only her identity, but also her reception. Interestingly, Pompadour's commission took place a year after she ceased to be Louis XV's mistress. The use of Ottoman imagery then takes its meaning in the context of this political marginalization. The portrait of Lady Mary, Wortley Montagu, attributed to Jonathan Richardson, another artist never went to the Ottoman Empire, is another example of self-representation, which differs slightly from that of Madame de Pompadour's. The full-length standing figure incorporates visual signs of Lady Mary's famous sojourn in the Ottoman Empire, indicated by her Turkish attire and the distant view of a city, possibly Istanbul, though no particular effort is being made to confirm it. The portrait does not depict Lady Mary simply as cross-dressed, but rather transubstantiated into a Turkish woman. This possibility of metaphorical shift towards the other can first be drawn from Lady Mary's own writings, and secondly, from the painting's unconventional pictorial mode, which alludes to the Ottoman manner without completely rejecting the conventions of European painting. A substantial portion of her letters from the Ottoman Empire, later compiled as Turkish embassy letters in 1763, written as a kind of travel narrative between 1716 and 1718, was devoted to comparisons and commensurability between Ottoman and European cultures. Most interestingly, she observes and articulates the affinity between them through a series of commentaries on art. Describing her experience in a Turkish bath at Sofia, Lady Mary wrote, "There are many women amongst them, as exactly proportioned as ever any goddess was drawn by the pencil of a Guido or Titian, and most of their skins shiningly white. I had the wickedness enough to wish secretly that Mr. Jarvis, British artist, could have been there invisibly. I fancy it would have very much improved his art." Unquote. The speculation that these Ottoman ladies might be considered as models before a European artist can now be brought into play by Lady Mary herself posing as a Turk. This presumed Turkishness is also further reflected in Richardson's rendition of the standing figure, recalling some aspects of Ottoman paintings of the same period. Despite the stylistic contrasts between Eastern and Western traditions of paintings, there is an equally striking resemblance between Lady Mary's image and the dancing girl by the Ottoman painter Abdülcelil Çelebi, known as Levni, which is part of an album containing 42 full-length portraits dating from the first decades of the 18th century. Both figures are wearing Turkish dresses with décolleté necklines, pearl-strung headbands, three-band bracelets, and jewelry-encrusted belts. Richardson's forward-leaning three-quarter face, as well as the S-shaped posture pulling up a skirt, is also akin to Levni's innovative style that first appeared at the end of the 17th century. Levni's paintings, with their innovative style, detected in greater animation of figures, rendition of moods, and details in costumes are usually considered to be the mark of the tulip period, Lale Devri, in Ottoman historiography, which is characterized by its receptiveness to European technology and art during the reign of Ahmet III. Indeed, the presence of the Flemish artist Jean-Baptiste van Moor, who lived in Istanbul for 38 years, may have not been inconsequential for Lebanese art. Van Moor served as the official artist to the French ambassador, the Marquis de Ferial, in Istanbul, and eventually made his name as a resident artist in Istanbul, working for Ottoman, European, and expatriate patrons, who included Lady Mary herself, as this conversation piece attributed to him attests. Van Moor himself made use of costume images for this portrait, which shows her in Turkish attire, grabbing the elbow of her son with one hand and holding a handkerchief in the other. The combination recalls the patterns established by local artists for costume books. While the Ottoman costume books served as proper compositional prototype for Van Loo and Van Moor, Richardson's access to Turkish painting is difficult to determine. Yet we know that Turkish paintings circulated in Europe either as individual pages or through a number of reproductions bound into albums, such as those I have already shown. By the same token, Lady Mary may have acquired works by Ottoman artists that Richardson was then able to draw on, although no such album has come to light. We know that Richardson collected Rembrandt's copies of Mughal paintings and sketched Ottoman subjects. In effect, I'm going too fast. In effect, what some scholars have identified as an unconventional style in Richardson's portrait of Lady Mary, or ambiguity, particularly with regard to the undefined picture plane, is what gives her the impression more than the mere fantasy of being the other. Lady Mary's famous letters form the basis of the critique of her own otherness to the society into which she was born. A singular character of her time, Lady Mary was a traveler, poet, and intellectual, and a de facto outsider in a world in which learning, literature, and exploration formed the exclusive domain of men. In that sense, Lady Mary's exoticism, or Turquerie, like Madame de Pompadour's, should be seen as a motivated act. It attests to the pressing desire or need of energetic individuals like herself to develop strategies of self-representation, synonymous with empowerment. In the interest of time, I will not speak about architecture today, maybe next time, but I want to end with two artists whose names have become synonymous with Turquerie, Jean-Baptiste Van Moor and Jean-Étienne Lyotard. Employed by Lady Mary's nephew, John Montagu, Lord Sandwich, on his grand tour in 1738, excuse me, Lyotard arrived in Istanbul and spent a 5-year residence there and elsewhere in the empire. As Christel Sementek has shown, this experience transformed both him and his art. He dressed like an Ottoman subject and grew a beard, which he cut off only in 1756 on the eve of his wedding. Although he did not go as far as Lady Mary's son, Edward Montagu, in converting to Islam, he did label himself the Turkish painter, le peintre turc, until the end of his life. Lyotard made his career producing works for clients from all over Europe and the Ottoman Empire. we still lack a comprehensive treatment of his time and work in the Ottoman Empire, partly because most of his work from this period is lost or forgotten. Lyotard's art reflects an emphatic synthesis of cultures, which was not lost on 18th century viewers, though it was not associated directly with Turkish painting, but with Chinese. The Anglophile Francesco Algarotti, who bought Lyotard's pastel La Chocolatière for the royal collection in Dresden in 1745, while admiring it, deemed it to be rather unusual, even somewhat Chinese. Interestingly, Lyotard himself idealized Chinese painting as bright, shadowless, and neat, which can be considered as an indirect comment on Turkish art, whose features are usually described at the time, in the 18th century as well, as austere and bold, with a disdain for surface prettiness and quite stark color effects. Not my words, 18th century description of Turkish art, with roots in Central Asia. Lyotard's Turquerie, while subtly breaking the conventions of European painting, was also driven by commercial interests. In 1753, Horace Walpole called him avaricious beyond imagination. Indeed, his portraits, free of flattery and still lifes with shiny surfaces, commanded staggering prices at the time. What we also see in Lyotard's paintings is the confluence of consumption and imitation of Eastern commodities, such as costumes, textiles, and tea sets, which were in circulation in Europe in the 18th century. Another object of circulation and consumption was the engraved collection of Jean-Baptiste van Moore's paintings of Ottoman types, some of which we have already seen. Van Moore lived in Istanbul from 1699 until his death in 1737, just a year before Lyotard's arrival. Many of his early paintings are known only by their engraved versions in the Recueil de son Destin, a work commissioned by the French ambassador, Charles de Ferial, after returning from the Ottoman Empire in 1711. So it's not clear who benefited from this commercial enterprise, the ambassador or the artist. But the book was very quickly translated into several European languages and reissued many times. The Ferial Album opens with the images of the Sultan and his court and ends with a public ceremony of a marriage and a funeral. Its clear structure and all-encompassing view of the Ottoman society stimulated enormous public appeal. The plays were used in theatrical productions throughout the 18th century. They became models for paintings on porcelain made by Meissen, French and Dresden manufacturers. After 1744, Johann Joachim Candier, who introduced the new modeling and decorative techniques to the Meissen porcelain, created a series of figurines based on the Ferial prints. It is possible that around this time that the dressed versions of the Recueil also appeared, pointing to its private and pastime uses as well. In fact, a complete set has recently come to light at the Detroit Institute of Arts after our inquiry about their existence, myself and my MA student Miriam Charlton. I'm grateful to my student Miriam Charlton for going to the DIA during COVID lockdown, and to the curator Claire Rogan for generously sharing many documents relating to the collection, which they had no idea was in the collection. It was a bequest of American collector Jerome Irvin Smith, who worked at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn until his retirement in 1975. There is still a lot to learn about these prints and their use, since they were not only dressed, but also framed to be hanged on the walls. This new discovery opens up new ways of understanding the Ferial Album, consumption of the images of the Turks, and their American collectors. So we moved from the French collector, Auguste Bob, to an American collector. And this is the beginning of a new research on Turquerie. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope it wasn't too long.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor. We had a wonderful time listening to you. I want to thank you on behalf of everyone here. I'm sure there are some questions from the audience. I think we can take a few questions. My colleague will conduct. Oh, there's a mic, so we will actually have a mic. If there's anyone has questions, we can move the mic around.
I have a small question. I caught that you had said there was an English nobleman who built a structure in Nancy, France. Is that correct?
Yes.
And what kind of structure was it, and does it still exist?
None of these buildings exist, but they were built in...
Speak into the microphone.
Oh, sorry.
For the live stream.
So your question is about the Turkish kiosks in Lunéville near Nancy?
Yes, please.
Yes. They were destroyed in the 19th century, and Vauxhall is also disappeared, and the mosque is also disappeared. All these architecture have disappeared, but they were initially built to last.
Ah, interesting. I would have loved to have seen them.
Pagoda is there at the Kew Gardens in London, built around the same time.
Excuse me. Sorry. I'm coming.
Most of these were costumes that were for portraiture and painting, but were there also textiles that sort of made their way into everyday life, like we see in the English-India connection, the Paisleys,
Yes.
the Jamavars became, part of every
Their life.
upper class English home, and
Yes.
they actually lived with these very Indian textiles. So I was wondering, was there anything Turkish that was other than, for the fun of dressing up and being painted?
Other
so
than
to
for the
speak?
portraits.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this question. No, they existed. Actual costumes were brought to Europe, and Lyotard wore them on his daily life. So did Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So did very many people who found the style actually very comfortable. So they existed, and I haven't looked at the history of textile from the 18th century, but the way these costumes are depicted suggest that they might have existed in reality. Yeah, and we do know people who dressed and hang around in Turkish costumes.
Hi, thank you so much for this very interesting lecture. I was very interested in the image that you showed of Lady Mary holding the hand of her son.
Yes.
In the Turkish style from the arm.
Yes.
But I was also interested in the black child emerging from behind her, like in
Yes.
the portrait. So can you talk a bit about that?
Yes, so this has been interpreted as a status symbol, the black page behind Lady Mary's portrait. It's a sort of traditional way of portraying aristocratic individuals, and Richardson may have just, continued that tradition. Yes, it's a status symbol, right, to have a black page. Whereas Van Moore's earlier painting is much more to her taste, probably.
Right.
Yeah, this one. Yes, it's very, very playful. And I mean, it's to Van Moore's credit also because he is very much open to Ottoman influences and clearly looking at local practices and maybe working with local artists. The connection between Levny and Van Moor is definitely there, but we haven't proven it yet.
Hello, Yavo. Thank you again for this great talk. And I have a question again. Can you remind us when Turkish coffee was introduced into, you said France, or what part of Europe was it introduced, the Turkish coffee, and how that impacted,
This
this
is
idea
also
with exoticism in drinking coffee? Yeah.
Yes, a very good question also, thank you. Apparently, coffee arrived long before it came from the Ottomans to Europe, from India or from southern Arabia. But the histories of coffee very directly associate the practice and some of the material culture associated with it, with the Ottomans, because Ottomans, has this status of being a great empire. So if the Ottomans are using, they might as well use it. But very quickly, coffee becomes a French product, of course. At the beginning, it was said to be introduced, but apparently it existed before. There are great literature on that, actually, and I'm not an expert.
Sorry, didn't see you.
Just a quick question on the handkerchief.
Yes.
Now, where did the handkerchief come from? Was it indigenously created, or did it come from the English?
It seems to have arrived with the English. The handkerchief is there in the Ottoman context, of course. The sultans are holding them and sultanas are holding them. They're also great items of gift to the English court, to all the courts around Europe, receive tons of fabrics and especially handkerchiefs from the Ottomans. So maybe they made a huge leap into this other aspect because of the pervasiveness of this particular object.
Maybe we can thank you. Any more questions? Okay, so if not, I'd like to say thanks again, a very warm thanks to Professor for speaking today, to my colleague, for introducing the event, and we'd like to invite all of you to a reception next door. Please do join us. You'll have more opportunities to interact and spend some more time together. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for listening. Biraz yeni şeyler de ekledim. Mimari yapmadım. Sadece senin mimar. Mimar. Another